in this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast.
And the reality is, as you know, like, you want the ability to use carbohydrates, which is part of metabolic flexibility. So if you imagine that it's like a barbell model, your right end of the barbell is carbohydrate metabolism, which you definitely want to the highest degree. And then on the other end of the barbell, you definitely want fat metabolism to the highest degree you can.
Right.
And the third component is how fast can you switch back and forth between those two.
Welcome to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your endurance potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson. I have a PhD in molecular exercise physiology, and I'm the founder of Critical Oxygen, where my mission is to build better endurance athletes through remote education and in-person physiological testing. Welcome back to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your athletic potential. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Mike T. Nelson, where we're going to talk all things metabolic and physiological flexibility. Mike is a research fanatic who specializes in metabolic flexibility, heart rate variability, and human performance. He has spent 20 years of his life learning how the human body works. He has a PhD in exercise physiology and a master's degree in mechanical engineering. He's an associate professor at the Carrick Institute, an instructor at Rocky Mountain University. He created the Flex Diet certification and the Physiologic Flexibility certification, and he's a human optimization specialist. He has published research in both physiology and engineering peer-reviewed journals, and in his free time, he enjoys spending time with his wife, lifting odd objects, going to metal concerts, and kiteboarding. If you want to learn more, check out www.miketnelson.com. Dr. Mike Nelson, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much. Good to be here.
Yeah. I'm really excited that you're on my show now. You were gracious enough, to have me on your show a little while ago. So, maybe we have a little bit of cross listeners and those sort of things. But yeah, today let's just dive into it. So first and foremost, can you give maybe like a brief introduction, in your own words of who you are, why you got into human optimization, and kind of this idea of metabolic and physiologic flexibility, and then we can kind of just roll from there.
Sure. I got into it like probably most guys in high school. I got crushed by the empty bar when we started lifting.
Yep.
And I thought, oh, well, maybe I should do something about this. But we had I don't know if you're old enough to remember the presidential physical fitness test thing they had.
I heard, like rumors of it.
Yeah.
But we might have done, maybe a mile test or something along those lines, like in elementary school.
Yeah. And in theory, it was a good idea, but at least where I was at was like poorly executed. All they did is just come in and test you, and if you sucked like I did on everything, then you just got made fun of by everyone else.
Right.
But they never showed you how to get better at it. It's like They just come in and test you, and it's like, oh look, the freaks are good, and then oh wow, like you're hanging from the bar, start your pull-up test. I'm like, oh, I already started.
You're like, you're not moving. I am starting my pull-up test right now.
Yeah. And then. Yeah, kind of, that was actually a bad taste for exercise, so I didn't do anything then. Went to college, thought maybe I should start lifting again. And along the way, I just thought some kids were bad at sports and get hit in the face with balls, which was me. And I just figured that's just the way that it is. But went to college, started training, started taking anatomy and physiology for fun, where did my undergrad at St. Scholastica in Duluth, Minnesota. They actually had cadavers, so you could do cadaver testing for anyone who signed up for anatomy and physiology. So that was great. Just started taking more courses on that, just got more interested in it, trying to figure stuff out for myself. And then, did almost 8 years of college the first time, and then went back, did some post-grad stuff, eventually did my PhD in exercise physiology. And along the way, just, went to conferences for fun because I thought, this is kind of cool. Mostly initially just apply to myself, and then later I realized, oh, wow, I can actually help other people by doing this. And then my PhD dissertation, ironically, I was doing postgraduate work in the PhD program in biomedical engineering. And I eventually dropped out of that because I didn't want to do any more math. And I get really tired of doing math, even though I had a minor in mathematics by that point. So I go over to physiology. And the first day, my advisor's like, hey, we got 2 brand new projects. And they both involve math. and he points at me. There's only like 5 people in our department at the time, and he's like, "Hey, you, math boy, whatever your name is, like these are your projects now." And they were on a heart rate variability and metabolic flexibility. And so, luckily, the math involved in that, while it was complex, wasn't nearly as bad as some of the stuff I had done before. You know, it was different types of variability analysis, like fast Fourier transforms from time domain to frequency domain and stuff like that. So a little bit more complicated stuff, but not nearly as bad as some of the stuff I was doing before with differential equations and stuff. So just started doing that, and I realized that, oh, this is actually kind of interesting. And I had been interested in heart rate variability for quite a while. I had tracked down I think I talked to every original Omega Wave user back in the like 2004, 2005 area, and paid one of them like a big steak dinner just to tell me how the thing works and stuff. But I didn't have 35 grand at the time or whatever it was to get one. So it turned out to be pretty interesting. And then how those are related is my thesis topic technically was fine scale variability across different physiologic systems.
Right.
So the idea we're looking at was like heart rate variability. If you look small enough, there's this little bit of variability, and that's a marker that the system everything is good and happy. So does that variability apply across different physiologic systems? Because at the time, every system we looked at, it did. So if you do really intricate fine gait analysis, you'll find that gait isn't exactly metronomically the exact same step. There's a pattern there, but there's a little bit of variability to each step, each speed. If you look at sway, a little bit of variability to sway, breathing, heart rate. And so we were trying to apply that same variability analysis to RER, so respiratory exchange ratio, thinking that, okay, healthy people at rest, even though we have them on the metabolic cart, even though they're at steady state, even though all the books say, you know, you're supposed to be at, 0.75 or whatever it is, and that never changes. Any physiologist who's done this on healthy people at steady state, you're bored, right? So you're watching the machine to make sure it doesn't mess up or they belch or, what's going on. And you see the RER will kind of bounce around. You'll see 0.76, 0.77, 0.74, 0.75. Assuming you're not doing averaging and all that stuff, you're looking at the breath by breath raw data.
Right.
And our argument was that's actually the system, because there was a lot of counter arguments that no, that's an error in the measurement system. And as far as I can tell, it's not. As long as you're called right and everything is good, you're using a legit system. That is the variability in the physiologic system you're looking at. Because we could check some obese people, which we did in a pilot study, and that variability went away. It disappeared compared to healthy people.
So interesting. No, it's really interesting how quickly people are, or how readily people say, oh, well, that's just an error in the measurement. Yeah. It's like, well, we're saying that this is like the quote unquote gold standard for measuring this sort of stuff, and it's pretty sensitive equipment. So, so maybe it's not. And exactly like you're saying is like, well, in healthy individuals, there is that variability. In unhealthy or less healthy individuals, that variability kind of goes away. And immediately when you said that, there was so my master's advisor and I used to talk a lot about like how much harder it is to ride in erg mode on a bike than it is to just kind of, have a fan bike and then have a target power output. And our explanation or our thought process was well, maybe the people who are not as good at erg mode need that variability because you're switching recruitment of different muscle fibers, so variability within the system, and you're not going 300 watts the entire time. You're going, 290 up to 310 down to 290, and it's this like oscillation, which so that's something that immediately came to mind. And then I've also actually seen it in really, really fit individuals in the NIRS response as well. So if you've again, like done enough testing with things like NIRS and other things like that, you actually start to see there's individuals that kind of have this weird, kind of oscillating pattern in their SMO2 where you're like, man, I swear they're doing the same power output. They haven't moved their hands from the handlebar. They're not sitting up. They're not moving around. And yet I'm still seeing this oscillation, and we've seen it, probably in a handful of people. But so that's another thing that kind of comes to mind. And all of the regulation that actually comes into play there it's if you're into engineering, there's all these feedback systems.
Yep.
And the human body is just one extremely complicated feedback system. So I'm sure you started to notice like, oh, well, what feedback systems are working, and then at what rate are they working? And then, that could potentially give us those oscillations, right?
Yeah, and I mean, every system we've looked at, if we look small enough in healthy individuals, you find fine scale variability, right? So SMO2 doesn't surprise me at all. With some of the EM braking machines and stuff, they can be so accurate that I think it's a detriment. I think that they're trying to hold you to dead nuts 300 watts, but people don't pedal that way. They can pedal an average of 300 watts, but like you said, I think they're a little bit above, a little bit below, a little bit above, a little bit below, that there's variability in that output. Yes, it averages out to the same, but now if you take a machine and you crush that variability, like you don't allow that because of how fast you can run those feedback loops and change it on the fly, I think it makes it actually worse.
And that would kind of explain why it's then harder, I think.
Yeah, and it'll feel harder, right? Even though your output is the same, it should be the same, but you're squashing that inherent variability that's in the system that they've developed as a better way of getting the output. Again, my guess is that it's more efficient, and you're crushing that efficiency, so they have to put out a little bit more effort, and it's just different. They're probably not practiced at it either.
Right, yeah, because people who ride erg mode all winter, they get better.
Oh
at
yeah,
erg
definitely.
Mode, right, but no, that's why for me personally, I just prefer, I have a C2 bike erg, and that's what I do everything on, and it's just it allows me to, if I feel like crap one day, I go easier. If I, I don't have to program the, like the actual power output that I want to ride to, and I can ride a little bit more to my physiological variability from day to day, maybe not within, the same minute or so. So let's continue on with this. So it started with noticing that there were these micro oscillations in metabolism, more or less.
Yeah.
And then, so you started to get or you started to do those measurements, and I take it you probably started in healthy individuals, and then you were like, oh, well, there's variability here. Is there variability in these sicker individuals? And were you able to like actually quantify that and say, from a variability perspective, I guess it would be similar to heart rate variability in a sense. Were you able to actually like quantify metabolic variability?
Yep. So what we did is we did it a little bit in reverse. So one other guy was there, and I helped with this data a little bit. We did just some pilot studies on healthy versus unhealthy people. And then we got the RERs, so we put them at steady state exercise. We had them come in and do VO2 max, so it was at a percentage of their max, so it was individualized per person. So in essence, they're doing the same percentage. And then we ended up using what's called sample entropy. So sample entropy is a non-variability analysis. Yeah, we don't need to go into that, but it's just a simple way of quantifying how much variability is present in the system. And you can then compare one system to the next system and see, does system A have more variability than system B, and actually have a hard number to compare the two. And we did that. What we found was obese people, they lost some of that fine scale variability. So what we ended up doing was a couple things. We did a gauge R&R study. So we had healthy people come into the lab, because the first question then is, okay, so if we do this on healthy people and we do it on different days under the same conditions, we should get the same result. If we don't get the same result, then this measurement system is shit, and it doesn't matter what intervention we do, it's not going to hold up. So we did that. We had healthy individuals come in. We did their VO2 max. We did body comp, all this stuff. They went away. They came back for, I think it was either 2 or 3 trials. I can't remember. And we put them at, 30% of their VO2, 60%, and then the last minute, I think they just went at like 100 or 120%. And so we had this block of 30% and 60%, and we had it over, I believe, 3 different days. And what we found in English is that, hey, day 1, day 2, day 3, they were all the same conditions, but they were on different days. And what we found was, yeah, they were all within the same limits. meaning that the system is stable enough that without an intervention, you can come in and we would expect a similar result, right? So if we found that they were different every day, well, sorry, this isn't a very good measurement.
Right.
So that was good. And then we did some other stuff too. Then we did a study looking at energy drinks. So the next question was, okay, if we give people something to push the variables around, will it be different? And so at the time, there wasn't much data on energy drinks. And I was also interested to make sure that whatever study I set up, I actually wanted to graduate and get the hell out of there. And the deal was, I had to publish 3 studies. And as you know, if you do something and it's not very interesting, you can do a lot of work and you can never get published.
Yep.
So I'm like, I need to make this thing sexy in terms of if it shows that energy drinks are the devil's piss, then, oh boy, everyone's going to be excited about it. Everybody assumes that they're bad. Again, this is probably 12 years ago. So if it shows there's no effect, then that's also interesting, right? People are like, oh my God, I thought energy drinks were going to destroy these people. It turns out they're not so bad. So I thought either way, I'm going to be safe. Either way, someone's going to want to, publish this data. So we did that. We gave them, it was standardized for caffeine. We gave them, and we did a placebo match thing. And we did FMD, so flow mediated dilation, which was a separate study. And then we did maximal, I think we did a ride to exhaustion. I originally wrote it as a time trial, but then we didn't really have highly experienced people, and that had its own issues. And so I ended up doing ride to exhaustion to match all the early caffeine data, because most of that's ride to exhaustion. And then we did HRV, we did resting heart rate, and we found that, yeah, in some people, like energy drinks, do help performance. Shockingly, it didn't move HRV around that much, although resting heart rate did go up a little bit. The FMD data, so flow mediated dilation, we were going to publish it, but unfortunately, we're doing healthy people. And in that measurement, just walking into the lab, there can be a huge range just in the healthy range.
Right.
And we saw a pretty high standard deviation. But if you looked at it across all 3 trials, it wasn't really that different per individual. But when you pool all the data, I want to say we had 14 subjects, your standard deviation is kind of high. So my advisor's like, well, you suck as a sonographer, I can't publish this. And I'm like, but look, it's very similar per individual.
Yeah.
I'm like, look, it's like, and he's like, no, we have to pool all the data, your standard deviation's too high. So your option is just to try to enroll more people. But I'm like, I just got the freaks. Like we had like 5% of the highest people that were recorded and 5% of the lowest people recorded.
Right.
So we just happened to get this range of people walking into the lab that effed my study.
Yeah. Well, I just had a conversation with somebody who was asking about resting SMO2 values measured via the MOXIE. And it is highly variable. It can go from 30% to 80%. And apparently they're getting a ton of reviewer pushback of like, well, why is that the case? How do you know that's true? And I'm like, that's just that's variability in the regulation of blood flow when you're at rest. Like there's not much regulation on muscle blood flow. Well, there's regulation, but there's not much at rest compared to when you go to exercise.
Yeah, because there's no demand. Like as long as you got enough to make sure the tissue doesn't die, who cares?
Yeah, exactly. So that could be, that could mean for some people you actually get quite a bit of blood flow, and then for other people it's like not very much at all.
Yeah, excluding injuries and everything else that might be going on with them.
Right, exactly. And it's like, as a researcher, you don't have time to look into, it's like, oh, do you have, like a slight IT band tightness, or like a former, like all of this sort of stuff. Like, oh, do you have, like a slight, or were you exercising a little bit too hard the last 2 days, like those sort of things. So yeah, I feel for you there, because that's what happens a lot of the times in like the NIRS data is, especially with MOXIE, is that, people try to average, like resting data, and even during different exercise intensities, it's still quite variable. And then people are like, oh yeah, like zone 2 is occurring at 25% SMO2 plus or minus 15%. You're like, how? You can't say it's 25% then, in my opinion. But
yeah, it's like basically like having people come into the lab and say, hey, we're going to put you on a bike, and 30% of your, I don't know, VT is going to be 125 watts or whatever, right? It's like, unless you do a max test, like you have no idea what percentage they're at. So my argument would be, which you probably agree, you have to do some type of standardization. So with VO2 max, we know that you do a max test. This is your max, just like you would do 1 rep max test for lifting. And then we'll take a percentage of that max because we know per individual, that's going to make that relative percentage the same across a slightly different population.
Right. You have to do some level of control or individualization of, you know, like the measurement, right? And you only know that by doing some level of test prior.
Yep.
It's the same thing when people approach me and they're like, well, I use 2 millimole and 4 millimole of lactate to determine thresholds. And I'm like,
good luck with all that.
Yeah, you can't do that, because another person reached out to me and they're like, well, I never reached 4 millimole, so they said I don't have a second threshold. I was like, well, did you go to failure during your test? And they were like, oh, yeah, absolutely. I couldn't go any harder. I was like, oh, okay, so obviously you hit past your second threshold. And then I started asking them, I was like, oh, are you in a caloric deficit right now? Have you been, you know, like, what sort of, you know, food are you eating? They're like, oh, well, primarily a high fat diet. I'm trying to cut weight.
That'd be my first question.
Yeah. They're trying to lose weight at the same time. I was like,
yep.
Well, there you go. That seems like really easy questions to be asking, you know, that's my first thing. But anyways, I digress. I just wanted to poke fun at lactate because that's what I like to continually do if people are using it in my eyes inappropriately. But yeah, so back to the you were exploring this variability, and I guess how does this eventually get to metabolic flexibility? Because the variability within the system is different than flexibility in a sense, right?
Yep. So my hypothesis of the whole thesis was, one, fine scale variability should show up across various physiologic systems, which it does appear to. And we did do, like I said, the gauge R&R, which shows that, hey, this test is reproducible. So what we were going to do then is like, okay, we believe that this fine scale variability for RER, once you standardize it, and we showed that 30% was more accurate than 60% of VT, that we're trying to get at what is a low intensity, non-invasive marker for metabolic flexibility. And our argument was that if you come in, you do a max test, and you put someone then at 30% of their VT, you can then have them run at steady state for 15 minutes. You can apply sample entropy to the RER that you got from breath-by-breath analysis, and you can get a variability score from it. The higher that fine-scale variability score is, the more metabolically flexible that person should be. That all sounds wonderful, but I did my 3 studies. I actually ended up doing 6 studies, 3 of them which never got published, but it took me 7 years. I extended every possible deadline, graduated a full 13 days before I would have gotten kicked out of the program and got nothing. And then I took my degree and left and figured, hey, this is cool. I published it. I did all this work. Someone else will look at it and see if it's a good marker for metabolic flexibility. And that was 12 years ago. And so far, nobody has.
I know it's like
for like non-satisfying.
No, I totally get it, because it's like you do these studies and it's like it's you're living and breathing it, and you're like, this is actually
sleeping
like
in the freaking lab.
Yeah. And you're like, this is actually like a super good idea, right? Because it's the only thing you're focusing on, and then it gets published, 5 people read it, and then somehow, and then nothing happens, from it. Which is sometimes, the ideas are, say, novel enough to get into like Nature or like other things like that, and then people start to take it. But it's wild to me. Somebody told me that statistic where it was like, yeah, you publish a paper and maybe like the average is like 5 to 10 people read it or something along those lines, which is it's just so sad. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you have any math involved in physiology, you're good friggin' luck.
Yeah.
Like literally, and that's not to poke fun at exercise physiology majors, is you don't, 99% of them don't have a background in math. It's just not their shtick. So, I mean, look at the field of like oxygen kinetics. Some really cool stuff, but if you don't understand math, it went nowhere because no one understands anything those people say.
Right. No, I know. And that's like, it's really, really interesting studies and really, really cool science that's happening, but only, 15, 20 people in the world, really fully understand it. And it's, so it just makes it so inaccessible, right? And that's like part of my mission, kind of by doing this podcast, is to be able to like let's talk about it. Let's get 1,000 years, 1,000+ years on this, and maybe there's some budding PhD research scientists that are listening to this. I hope so. And they start to think, oh, well, maybe I should go look at Mike's like previous papers and stuff like that, and maybe I can rekindle this a little bit, because I was going to ask you, I was like, well, so what came of it? And, it seems like this is like a in the world of AI and, machine learning and other things like that. This seems like it's ripe for somebody to introduce it into their, metabolic carts, in a sense.
Yeah, and I've talked to the people at VO2 Master. I've talked to the people at Pinoe. I mean, I have a Pinoe device, and both of them are super cool, but it's a hard sell because, one, you would have to do 2 tests, but most of these companies are already doing a VO2 max test, so they already have a max test on record. And my argument was, just do some low-level exercise and just measure RER. If you're accurate with breath by breath, then you can see what's going on.
Right.
And it's like anything. Like, you publish a study and you hope, yay, it's in the world, people will read it and do something with it. And no, not really. I mean, even if someone comes along and says, hey, this didn't work at all. All right, cool. But it would still be nice, I think, to have a non-invasive marker for it, because then you can do training, you can see changes, there's a lot of stuff you can do. And maybe it would get to the point, if we're good enough at estimating a VO2 max, that you could make it very sub-threshold. So you may not necessarily need to do a max test on everyone. You just have to make sure that it's sub-threshold enough. And then if you can, like all these clinics where you can't do bloods, you can't do anything else, there's a lot of portable, metabolic carts now. It'd be a pretty darn easy test to run. It's sub-max. People hate doing max testing. And you could be like, hey, let's do this baseline and assess your metabolic flexibility. Week 1, let's do this program for weight loss, whatever it is. Week 16, we do this, low intensity measurement again. Wow, look, your variability got better. So we can tell you that you're becoming, more metabolically flexible. Again, if we have the data to show that is actually true.
Right. And that's so when you use the term metabolic flexibility, you are referring to the variation in, say, RER that is occurring at very low exercise intensities. But so I was taking metabolic flexibility from a different standpoint, where it was, I worked with mice. My whole PhD was, how does diet and exercise interventions affect our mitochondria? So what we would do is we would have people, do like a meal tolerance test. And you can do this a number of different ways. You can have a mixed meal. You could have something that's really high glucose. You could inject glucose solution into mice and then measure, blood glucose afterwards. But the whole point is that you're measuring either a change in RER in response to that meal, or a change in blood glucose in response to the meal as well. So is that kind of getting at the same sort of concept, just not from an exercise perspective?
Yep. So what I was trying to do is say that, okay, these small changes in RER, this variability, is a marker for, sort of system-wide metabolic flexibility. Just like heart rate variability. We know that we can take the average of heart rate. We can look at, air quotes, macro variability in heart rate, from low heart rate to high heart rate. We can do the same thing with metabolic flexibility. We can look at the small variability, which is what I was looking at in my PhD thesis, and hopefully that is correlated to the wider range of RER under different challenge conditions. Because the other bugger, and this is still true in the research, there is no gold standard for metabolic flexibility.
Right.
People have proposed all these different tests. You go back to David Kelly's stuff, which was, doing a clamp study across muscles in the thigh.
Right.
There's feeding studies. It's the same thing with like insulin clamp studies, right? So for people who aren't listening, you go into the hospital. We start an IV in one arm, we run a shit ton of glucose. We start an IV in your other arm, we run a shit ton of insulin. And we basically put you into this supraphysiologic range, and we kind of just see what happens.
Yep.
And that's a good marker for metabolism. But other people have argued that it's so supra physiologic that it's only going to find kind of the worst case scenarios. So you
Right,
kind of have
right.
the same thing with metabolic flexibility. You've got the people that are the purists, I say, where you're like, man, we just got to do it with IVs. We got to bypass digestion and all this stuff and see what the changes are.
Hmm.
Then you have other people who are like, well, that's not really valid in the real world. So you have to do it with some food that they consume, not even a glucose solution. So we'd use some bolus of food. But then
Hmm.
you have fiber and variability in the digestion. And
Yep.
how big of a change in RER is really useful? Do we use, like you said, blood glucose as a surrogate marker? Are we only looking at RER changes? Are we only doing this at
Right.
rest? Are we doing this during exercise?
Or is it blood insulin changes too, right?
Or
'Cause
is it
there's
insulin changes?
right,
Gerald
you know.
Reven would say it doesn't matter, like metabolic syndrome. He was very against the whole thing. He's like, it's all just based on insulin dynamics. And yeah, so nobody agrees.
Right. So the answer is we don't have a gold standard measure. You know, as much as people want to say there is a gold standard measure, like there was time and time again, people would be like, oh, well, you know, the gold standard measure for insulin tolerance, at least, you know,
Right.
what was your or I guess it would be glucose tolerance, was the hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp, right?
Yep.
And that's what we used. We used that fairly regularly, and we didn't use it on mice, but we used it on humans after either drug interventions or exercise interventions.
Cool.
And I think from a research perspective, you know, like just having something that is really well established and something that is just, you know, like defined is really good.
Oh, sure.
You know, because everyone can argue, you know, like what are the positives, what are the negatives, what are the limitations to every single thing that you do. Like, for example, I did a lot of mitochondrial respiration on isolated mitochondria, but what some other people would argue is that, well, if you're isolating mitochondria, you might be getting all the populations of mitochondria that are the healthiest. So you're going to get the best representation of what, you know, the mitochondria are truly capable of, void of anything that could be limiting to transport of any substrates.
Yep.
So what people have done, you know, to combat that is they've taken single muscle fiber isolations, permeabilized those, put them in a chamber, so you have, you know, one or two like a muscle fiber bundle, and it's like tiny amount of muscle, like maybe 5 milligrams or something. And you know, then you're spinning the muscle fiber at a certain amount of RPMs, and you're, you know, adding all these substrates and stuff. And you know, there's some people who are like, yep, that's the way to go. And, you know, I could probably argue a million different ways as well. Oxygen diffusion is actually limiting for those sort of situations. And if you, you know, this, that, and the other. So there's always those sort of arguments. And, you know, just having something, though, you know, that can get us at least part of the way there, if not most of the way there, I think, like, that's how I view it. And then, you know, not even like going back to your variability, you know, at 30% of ventilatory threshold or lactate threshold, whatever you want to measure.
Yeah.
If you measure it time and time again using the same protocol, you can start to track, oh, how is it changing for that individual over time?
Yep.
Because, you know, we know that heart rate variability, for example, you know, can be really, really high in some individuals. So, like if people wear a Whoop out there, you know, I've had people that I've coached that their overnight variability is like 120 milliseconds or something, however they're measuring it. I used to wear Whoop, and my variability never got above 50 or 60. But it's the pattern over time. So, you know, so you'd be like, oh, well, this guy, he's doing way better. But it's how is it changing? Either. Yeah. How is it changing over time, and then how is it changing relative to what your average is, right?
Yep. Yeah, and that was sort of my backup argument was, okay, so maybe we don't know this thing is actually a good marker for metabolic flexibility, but hopefully people will use it because we did a study showing that the measurement is stable. So if somebody does lose 40 pounds or they drastically increase their VO2 max or whatever, we would expect that this marker is going to change. Now, again, we don't know how much it's going to change. We don't know what is useful. But to your point, I was hoping people would then run it as a baseline marker for, you know, weight loss programs or different interventions, you know, because if it does prove to be true, it'd be kind of nice to come in and be like, hey, we did this non-invasive, test again 4 weeks later. Hey, look, you are becoming more metabolically healthy, just like we can show with heart rate, just like we can show with heart rate variability, just like we can show with performance data, that you are going in the right direction. Like, you may have not lost a ton of weight, but you're doing the right things. Your metabolism's moving in the right direction.
Right. Right. And then, the key is we just need something sensitive enough to actually detect that change over time.
Correct.
And it's so encouraging to people, if it is going in the right direction, like, or even just having like a number to say, hey, something's going on and things aren't as good as they can be, but the good news is you can improve it. And that's like whenever I test somebody, like do a VO2 max test, and if their VO2 max comes back a little low, they're a young person, maybe their VO2 max is, on the low side of whatever, the ACSM ranges are. I'm like, it's all right. The good thing is that we can do high intensity interval training and your VO2 max is going to respond like gangbusters because you've never done that before. And, I have some experience improving people's VO2 maxes,
Yeah.
So it's just another number or metric, in order to show people, hey, this is actually working, as opposed to just be like, well, doing more exercise has been shown to improve metabolic flexibility and in metabolic health, and then not doing any measures of it. It's kind of like, well, is it? Like, especially on an individual to individual basis. So
yeah.
So I guess so you've taken this idea, and I mean you've made a certification out of it, metabolic flexibility
Correct.
certification.
Yeah,
so
flex diet cert.
Oh yeah, flex diet certification. Sorry.
That's right.
So how like obviously without teaching the entire class right now, like how do you take that idea that this micro variability in in metabolism is then how do you apply that to real world scenarios and other things like that, since it's not packaged in an app and you can't just go and do those tests?
Yeah, so if we take the concepts and we scale it up to you as a human organism, like in the fitness world, everyone argues about, oh, carbohydrates are the best fuel, like, oh, don't eat fat, it's going to make you fat, or you've got the reverse of, everybody just do keto because carbs are going to make you fat because insulin, and
right.
If you want to sell a popular diet book, you just demonize one whole macronutrient group. Too much protein, your kidneys are going to fly out of your back and, kill someone in the gym, or, something's bad with everything.
Right.
And the reality is, as you know, like, you want the ability to use carbohydrates, which is part of metabolic flexibility. So if you imagine that it's like a barbell model, your right end of the barbell is carbohydrate metabolism, which you definitely want to the highest degree. And then on the other end of the barbell, you definitely want fat metabolism to the highest degree you can.
Right.
And the third component is how fast can you switch back and forth between those two.
Right.
So if you're going to the gym to lift some heavy weights, you're going to do some intervals, you want the ability to use carbohydrates to the highest degree, because that's going to provide you the highest level of performance,
right,
via anaerobic metabolism, all that kind of stuff. If you block carbohydrate use, right, and there's a couple of ways you can look at this. The best case is basically like McArdle's disease. So they have a genetic issue where they can't take glycogen and break it down. They're missing the phosphorylase enzyme. So they are horribly intolerant to any intensity in exercise. So literally their body is not able to use stored carbohydrates really at all. And that does confirm that we use carbohydrates for a lot more exercise intensity than what we think we do.
Right. Like
on the other end of the spectrum,
a higher range of exercise intensity,
yes,
from really low to extremely high.
Yep, exactly.
Yep.
Because when I first read those studies, I only thought it would be the very high end that would be impaired.
Right.
And what you find is, yes, that's true, but it has a really far bleed down effect that gets into, maybe their fat metabolism isn't the best, and you can train other pathways, etc. But it's a pretty wide range. And then on the other end of the spectrum, like if you're just hanging out, like we're having this conversation, like you definitely want the ability to use mostly fat, or you're fasting, or you're sleeping, overnight, which is a fast. You want the ability for low to moderate intensity exercise to primarily use fat. Now, again, if you get down in the weeds, you can use carbohydrates both anaerobically and aerobically. There's some benefits to that. But if you're doing low to moderate intensity exercise, you don't really need to run that 100% on carbohydrates. You
Right.
want to run some fat through the system. You get a lot more ATP per mole of fat that's being used. The downside, though, is it's slow. Like, you just can't get that fuel at a fast rate. You can get carbohydrates at a really fast rate, but you can't store as much pure fuel of carbohydrates.
Right.
So again, they both have their pros and their cons. And instead of just saying, oh, everyone just has to be high carb or everyone just has to be keto,
Right.
like shocker, like maybe you should train your body to use both systems. Like kind of like, hybrid cars are more of a thing now. Like maybe you should have a hybrid car. So if I want to drive to South Padre, Texas, I can use primarily gas. I want to, beat the guy next to me off the line. I'm going to use electric because I get a lot more torque.
Right.
I want to be able to use both, so I get the long range performance and I get the short range performance at the same time.
Yeah, that's what from a wellness. I mean, from both a performance and a health perspective, right? That's extremely important, and that's where the flexibility comes in. Is like, if you want to be able to be as healthy as possible, you have to be able to use that high. You have to be able to derive energy from carbohydrates at very high intensities. And then you also want to make sure that you're switching back, to fatty acid oxidation at those lower intensities. And when you stop being able to have that flexibility, that's when, that's when you start to present with, like your things like metabolic disease, type 2 diabetes, the chronic, other chronic diseases, which are highly controllable, in my opinion. So, okay. So you kind of outline that sort of stuff. And then is the best way to modulate or get somebody metabolically flexible to introduce exercise at both the low end of intensity and the high end of intensity?
Yeah, there's a couple things you can do. I mean, I would say motivation wise, if you came to me and said, this person will do whatever, like I'd still pick exercise is probably number one.
Yep.
So we're going to have you exercise to increase carbohydrate use. So that's going to be more higher intensity exercise. That's going to be things you talked about to increase our VO2 max, because we want just a bigger aerobic engine. A bigger aerobic engine is going to create more power. It's going to use more fuel. Even if we just hypothetically take your VO2 max from 30 milliliters per kg to 50, which again, it's going to take quite a while. That's a huge increase.
Right.
But just for the sake of argument, like by building that bigger engine, and we don't change the percentage of what you're using for carbohydrates or fat, you're going to use a lot more fat for energy because your engine is just that much bigger. And I think that's something that people kind of forget. So we want to do things to build the biggest engine possible. And then we want to do things to preferentially fuel it a certain way. So for intervals, repeats, high intensity stuff, you want to primarily run that through carbohydrates. And then low to moderate intensity stuff, like your zone 2, maybe your zone 3, depending upon where the person's at, what they're doing, that kind of thing. I mean, my bias, which I get a lot of shit for this, is that I would just do it fasted. Now, again, if your option is do it fasted or not do it, for God's sakes, please still do it. Right?
Yeah.
Like doing the thing first is still going to get you most of the benefit.
Right.
And that's probably my poor for miscommunicating that in the past. But if you have the option to do it fasted, I would still preferentially do it fasted, because you don't need high amounts of carbohydrates to do it. You do want to increase something called your fat max. So how the highest level and the most amount of fat that you can use, my argument would be get that as high as possible. However, don't impair your carbohydrate use when you do that.
Yeah.
So running more fat through the system, primarily fasted. Insulin's going to be low. Insulin is more of a fuel selector switch. So high levels of insulin push you to use more carbohydrates. Low level of insulin pushes you to use more fat as a fuel. So for most people, I would have them do that in the morning. It's just easiest to do that fasted. You can go really far down in the weeds, and some people may have to do a longer fast, maybe 18 hours or something like that. There's some debatable research in that area, but yeah, just do it fasted. You don't need carbohydrates. And then the other concept I do is what I call macro matching. or So you want to match the macronutrient to the fuel you're preferentially using. So if you're going to go to the gym and do some weightlifting, you're probably going to have more carbohydrates that day. We may even have carbohydrates before you lift. We may even have carbohydrates while you're actually lifting.
Right.
We want to push insulin up. We want to push you towards that carbohydrate metabolism as best we can. We want to fuel performance. We want to get that engine as big as possible and running as fast as we can. And then also, if you're doing like your zone 2 stuff, we want to match the macronutrient we're primarily using there, which is going to be fat. I don't think you need to take in a lot of fat. You can use stored body fat to do most of that work. So we would do that primarily in a fasted condition.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say this really pertains to individuals who aren't exercising a ton, like going for performance. And I'll defend what I mean by that is I have found that individuals who are training a lot, they're typically running a calorie deficit. So I always want them to, try to be in as much of a maintenance as possible. So the whole so this is where I'm trying to dissuade people from maybe doing the, say the fasted zone 2 work, because the zone 2 work, if you do it and you're doing it for 2, 3, 4, 5 hours a day, like if you're a good athlete, you could be burning a lot of calories during that time. And what I'm trying to have you do is stay as consistent as possible throughout your training. So I want you to be intaking something, whether that's before, actually it's probably before, during, and after. But for people who are, trying to maximize it for wellness, I think what you just outlined is crucial. I will also say that I don't think that in my opinion, the juice is worth the squeeze for the extra, increase in fatty acid oxidation that you would get, again, being an elite level, like a high level athlete, whether you're, like an age grouper or somebody like that who's training a lot, to do fasted cardio or do something where you deplete your carbohydrates over, during a really hard high intensity session the evening before, and then come back and do it. So, and that's just because for self-preservation, I want you as an athlete to be able to consistently train for as long as possible. And you run, you're implementing more stress, which yes, could get better outcomes in terms of adaptations. However, you're running a really thin line, especially if you're training, 10, 15, 20 hours a week. So I just want to make that differentiation between, like a wellness sort of thing, which I 100% agree with you here, Mike, versus, maybe a performance thing, which I again, it's marginal gains in terms of the fatty acid oxidation, primarily from the intervention with diet. I think exercise is going to be the sledgehammer for the metabolic control that you're looking for.
Yeah, so my counter argument, which I think we probably agree on this, and let me know what your thoughts is, for higher level athletes, I'm actually going to look at their crossover point on their VO2 max test. If their crossover point is really shitty and really low, I would make an argument from a health and potentially performance that increasing that is probably to their benefit. Now, again, the caveat is I've seen some elite level endurance athletes who are so carbohydrate dependent, they didn't even have a crossover period. Like they never hit 50% fuel usage either way. Now, in two of those cases, one of the cases, one out of the three, that person was an animal. They were actually winning races. The caveat is, as long as they didn't miss a station and as long as they absolutely nailed their carbohydrate intake every single time, they would do really good. Now, if they goofed that, they got some indigestion, they mixed it wrong, they didn't have the right electrolytes, whatever, they were done. Like they were completely just off the thing. So yes, if you're very, very high level, you are running more carbohydrates, period. Like if you're trying to break a 2-hour marathon, Kipchoge was running on 100% carbohydrate. He doesn't give a shit about his fat metabolism at all whatsoever. Right. But if you're somewhere in between, I would make an argument to an athlete, if they don't have a crossover period, to be like, hey, I think we can increase some of this and it will help your health. it may help your consistency of performance. I don't think it's going to change your all-out PR time. I don't think it's going to change your best time ever. But I do think it would make you more consistent over time to have a higher fat max. Now, again, no one's going to win races at their fat max. You're not.
Yeah, maybe like a really long ultra endurance, but
maybe.
So I do agree, and that's the importance. This is what I talk about all the time on this podcast is you got to measure it, right?
Yeah, totally.
So you if you don't measure it, then how do you know? And so for example too, you can also kind of mess with things, by eating beforehand. So if you're fat, so you would really want to do a metabolic flexibility test in a fasted state, figure out what's going on, or you could even do it in a fed state just to see how much you actually diminish the amount of fats that you're using. But yeah, I would agree. And then there's another, there was a guy I was talking to, and he was showing me metabolic data from this athlete. And he was like, this is a, like a test that we did when this athlete was probably under consuming food by 400, 400 to 500 calories, maybe more per day. And then this is what we did afterwards. He essentially had so he was technically, like starving himself in a sense. There was like no fat max because he was just, like so much stress hormones all the time that he was just purely relying on carbohydrates. Then they had him
sympathetically just pinned that whole system.
Yeah. So sympathetically, he was just, just probably pretty destroyed and heading down the wrong road. But then they had him start eating, like 500 calories plus another 200. So he was in like a 200 calorie surplus per day. Came back and his fat max, it was like a beautiful fat max curve. So it's like it's so hard unless you actually see the data to be like, oh, well, how many calories are you eating per day? Are you pretty stressed? Like, those sort of things, because that will help you, say, as a physiologist or a coach, make better decisions. And that's where I essentially always say is like, I would rather have an athlete just eating in a caloric maintenance unless we have to do some sort of body composition changes, which only should happen in the off season. Never do it in performance season. And then on top of that, also track, if you can, how your metabolism is changing from, a fasted perspective and from a fed perspective. And then you can start to make better decisions on, does this person truly need to do, or should they be doing fasted zone 2 training, or even like lighter, sort of stuff, or, is how they're feeling currently, is that adequate for, like the outcomes that they're looking for, right?
Yeah, and the other part people forget too is that as you scale up the amount of training time, especially in runners, you just don't have much time to friggin' eat, right? I mean, if you're training for like a full triathlon, like you're training multiple hours per day. Yeah, you're probably doing some swimming, you're doing some biking, you're doing a lot of running.
Right.
A lot of people can't eat a lot when they run. Biking, some people can, some people can't. But if you just look at your day, and let's say you're a professional, like most of your day is literally spent doing exercise, right?
Yep.
So you, by definition, tend to undereat because you're literally not sitting at your table, like you're on a bike or you're running.
Yep.
And a lot of people don't feel very good when they do that. And so I've seen that many times where it's like, your biggest issue is you unintentionally have too big of an energy deficit.
Yep.
Right. Everything from, relative energy deficit syndrome to all sorts of stuff. Women start running into all sorts of issues, and you look at their blood work, it's a freaking disaster. Their HRV is a shit show.
Right.
It's like,
You're like
you got bigger fish to fry than worrying about your fat metabolism at that
point. Yeah. So that's that's kind of where I come from, just because I had a tendency to greatly undereat, when I was running a lot and other things like that. And I think that did more harm than it did good. So that's, so that's my perspective. And that's why I'm a little bit more for it. Well, I would rather have you just be in a caloric maintenance, and then we can manage the rest of the stuff from there. So if that requires you, taking in, 30 grams of carbohydrates, say on the bike, even during zone 2 work, like I'm okay with that. So yeah. And I think too, again, just to double down on this whole exercise thing, I think that like exercise in and of itself is really going to be kind of like the biggest rock you can turn over in terms of maintaining metabolic flexibility. Because you got to think about, I think metabolic flexibility is both your capacity to oxidize both fats and carbohydrates. So that's going to essentially come from your mitochondria and then all the glycolytic enzymes that you're building up, and how much turnover you have per day. You know, and this is where this is a lot of people are, you know, like zone 2, so hot right now, right? Everyone loves their zone 2 for mitochondrial volume density and capillarization and those sort of things. And unless you're really doing, 5 to 10 plus hours of zone 2, there doesn't seem to be, it doesn't seem to be this magic pill, that it just automatically improves your mitochondria. But what I will say is that if you're doing a lot of zone 2 training, like 5-10 hours, you're turning over so many carbohydrates and so much fat that just that flux through the system is going to keep things moving, right, and not stagnate it. So if we're thinking about variability as oscillations, exercise is a really good way of making massive oscillations in your substrate metabolism, in a sense, without having any structural changes to your muscle and what's actually going on.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Like, we have another book I'm working on with 2 other co-authors about basically a high flux method, and it's geared more towards general population, intermediate athletes. An argument is just walk more.
Yeah,
this is really simple,
yeah.
Right? Because most people you're looking at, these are people who walk 5,000 steps a day. If you get up to walking 12,000 steps a day, like the amount of flux you've increased in your system, if you're doing that consistently, is pretty high and makes a big difference overall. I mean, if you gave me athlete A who says, hey, I'm weight stable and my flux is 1,800 calories a day, meaning we put 1,800 calories in the system, they burn 1,800 calories through active exercise, metabolism, all etc., everything else, and that's their neutral point. Versus athlete B who's at 3,600 calories per day, meaning they're putting 3,600 calories into the system and they're taking 3,600 calories out. I'll take athlete B at 3,600 calories all day.
Right.
Because I can absolutely guarantee you that any adaptation we want to do will happen much faster in that person because they have the turnover, they have the time, they have the capacity to do the stimulation of the thing that they need, they have the calories to recover, their substrate utilization is better, insulin management, glucose management, all that stuff. It's just better. The shitty part is that's a hard sell because it's more time, right? So to the average person, that means you're going to spend more time eating, you're going to spend more time exercising.
Right.
So our little sort of, I guess you could say, concession is, well, let's try to get you closer to that area and let's just use walking as the main intervention because we've got a lot of good data on it and you don't need a bike, you don't need anything fancy, you just go outside, just move.
Yep. Yeah, and that's that's something that I think I see people, or so one of my defaults is saying, oh well, don't run. Like if you're a runner, like don't run in zone 2. Like you're better off as running in zone 1 because running is so damaging to the body. And then at that point, if you're in zone 1, is like, well, you might as well just walk. And something that was really effective for me, I was training for a 50K race, and I would just try to walk as much as I possibly could. And I wasn't doing it because I was like, oh, my mitochondrial volume density is going to be so much better. Like I wasn't fooling myself there, but I was like, well, I'll be gaining tissue tolerance just because when you walk 15, 20, 30,000 steps a day, like
that's a lot.
Your feet are sore. The muscles in your feet are sore. You can even make your Achilles tendons a little bit sore and stuff like that. Obviously, you probably overdid it a little bit, but the point is that then you're allowing your body to absorb more impact later. So whether that's the high intensity interval stuff, which we know is like I keep saying sledgehammer, but just like a sledgehammer for adaptation. Like that is like the time efficient method of just making massive changes to your physiology. So you can either absorb more of that or you can absorb more volume going forward because your body is now used to walking 30,000 steps. You go out for a run and it's 10,000 steps, yes, the impact forces are going to be higher, but your tissue is going to be better at absorbing that. So you're essentially making your tissue more flexible as well, more resilient in a sense.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then related to zone 2 stuff, how much of the zone 2 stuff do you think, because a lot of it's been done in high level cyclists, not all of it, but a lot of it, how much of the benefit do you think is not even at some point more mitochondrial adaptations, but the fact that cyclists who are competitive by their nature are all crazy nutbags, and that they are, by virtue of making them do zone 2, they're not doing zone 3, 4, and 5. Meaning,
Right.
in my experience, it's the only way to throttle that type of athlete. Does that make sense?
No, 100%. And this is what I tell people as I say, zone 2 is what is going to facilitate recovery and adaptation so you can then go do harder shit more often.
Yes.
Or more hard shit, right? Like that's what it comes down to. And you need to oscillate back and forth. And I think it's been kind of blown out of proportion because of, like the cross country skiing studies and other things like that. And it for people like, and so back to my point of like the 5 hours seems to maximize what is it? It's mitochondrial volume density measured via transmission electron microscopy. So 5 hours of training seems to, reach a peak and then kind of plateau out. Whereas citrate synthase activity, which is a loose marker of mitochondrial volume density, seems to maximize around 10. According to, there was a study done by some really awesome guys over in Australia a few years ago where they, did a meta-analysis and all this fun stuff. And that's what they seem to, come to the conclusion is like 5 and 10 hours. The problem is that in order to actually do that, that's a lot of time, on the bike. And I think when we start to look at these really high level athletes, they just simply can't do more high intensity stuff.
No.
So they have to do lower intensity stuff. And, maybe for them walking isn't adequate because it doesn't move the needle at all.
No,
so they
it's
have
too
to
easy.
it's too easy. So they have to do something. And that something just happens to be, zone 2 or exercise at fat max or, whatever you want to call it. Right. So that's like everybody's, super in love with it and all of that. And I'm like, well, unless you can do 5 to 10 hours, then, you're probably not maximizing the mitochondrial volume density adaptations. But I can tell you this, I did a study during my PhD where we took people through, it was 10 intervals, 1 minute on, 1 minute off. And we did that every other day. And we improved. Yeah. So it was rough. It
was brutal, man.
But it was only 10 minutes worth of work, right? 10 minutes worth of work every other day. We improved mitochondrial function by 30% across the board. From
was it a 4 or 6 week study? How long was it?
It was 2 weeks.
2 weeks. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So we improved mitochondrial function in 2 weeks. So 7 sessions over the course of 14 days. And, so that's where I'm just like, it's the high intensity stuff that really, is shaping and driving those mitochondria to be better. And then, of course, like for the efficiency and, other things like that, you have to follow that up with light intensity exercise. And you couldn't ask a cyclist, well, you could, to do, 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off, 4 times every other day. Like you could ask them to do that and it would be freaking rough. And you would just, you'd have attrition levels out the, like crazy.
Oh, yeah.
So that's why you have to do something like zone 2 is the recovery aspect, the mitigation of fatigue, and just the continued adherence, to the actual training. Do you think that strength training helps to improve metabolic flexibility as well?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, the more muscle you can have, you just have more metabolically active organs.
Yep.
It doesn't do quite as much for metabolism as what people think from the acute sense, right? You add, let's say, magically add 5 pounds of muscle, I can't remember the exact number, but it's not very many more calories you're burning per se. Now, the caveat to that is most people as they age lose muscle. So if you're adding muscle, you're ahead of the game.
Right.
I think we do underestimate if you are more active, you have to move that mass around with you.
Right.
So you are going to burn more calories if you're walking more, you're doing things like that. So I think that is a underappreciated form of that. We know for protection against metabolic disease, more muscle is probably the best thing you can do.
Right.
We know from reduction of falling, hip fractures, both from trying to catch yourself as you fall, reflexes, to even having more muscle on your skeleton probably serves as some padding also to,
right.
Kind of deaden some of that, impact force. So there's a lot of beneficial things with that. There's it's just a huge disposal area for glucose, huge disposal area for the use of fats as fuel. Yep. So,
and a storage area in a sense for glucose. It's disposal and storage. So
yep.
You have somewhere for it to go. Like, so if you have a tendency to overeat carbohydrates, those carbohydrates have to go somewhere. If those carbohydrates can't, then your insulin will work harder and harder and harder, and eventually, you'll run into issues with storing it.
Yep.
So, okay, yeah, it's like I just wanted to ask that question just to, get your opinion on it, because it's like it is such an uphill battle. My parents are getting a little bit older, and it's such an uphill battle for me to be like, you guys have to do something that is strength related.
Oh yeah.
Like I don't care what it is, if it's body weight, if it's, just doing your Pilates, like whatever it is, you have to maintain muscle. And they're like, oh, well, we're not motivated to do so. I'm like, well, you'd be motivated if you knew that, like, a year down the road, you're going to slip, break your hip, and then, essentially lose 20 pounds of muscle mass and not be able to walk ever again. And maybe I need to be a little bit more direct with them in terms of that sort of stuff. But yeah, absolutely. I think, like having an adequate amount of muscle mass throughout your lifetime is a requisite for a healthy life. It's like, maintain VO2 max, be strong, so you can, have, kind of independently live, and being strong kind of comes with, having adequate muscle mass, and then, move. Like you're saying, right? It doesn't have to be zone 2 training. It can just be walking. And as long as you're walking, you're still going to be overturning, and you're still going to be, creating that flux to then have your body repair and do all that sort of stuff. And that's like, if I were to design, like a workout program for somebody, those are exactly what I would say. And then make sure it's something you like to do. So if you hate walking, okay, well, garden, or do, some sort of, like yard project, or, there's got to be something you can do that's like semi-active. And then, it's like, I always see you, doing you're like lifting your super heavy weights with your like metal and stuff like that. And it's like, yes, Mike has figured out exactly what he loves to do, to keep doing his strength training stuff. And, some people, like for me, for example, it used to work really well, like going to CrossFit. Like as much as, sometimes I don't agree with all the tenets of CrossFit, I love the fact that they make it, a community of people.
Oh, totally.
And, they encourage like weightlifting and being strong and like those sort of things. So, yeah, those are the things that I would tell people is like, do high intensity exercise to keep your VO2 max high, do heavy stuff to maintain muscle mass, and then do your low level physical activity. Because that's
the two things I would add is I would add something for a high rate of force development.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you have to do plyometrics or anything like that. So one thing I've done, which, shout out to the K-Box or Eccentrics, but there's a lot of devices like it now where it's a flywheel trainer. So if people have ever used it, if for a simple example, let's say I'm just doing a bicep curl on it, right? As I'm curling it, the cable is spinning this wheel. And when I get to the top, the wheel is going to go the other direction. So as I'm doing my bicep curl as an example, I'm really trying to move it as fast as I possibly can. But because that flywheel is large, it's not moving real fast. But my intent is to try to move it as fast as I can. And then on the eccentric, on the lowering, I'm trying to slow it down as much as I can, but that wheel is spinning and it's literally trying to rip me back down again. So it's a really cool way to do some rate of force development that's like really safe.
Yeah.
Because I don't know, I just turned 50 and I'm like, yeah, I do some plyometrics and some, drop jumps and stuff like that. Mostly just if I get dropped out of the sky kiteboarding, I don't blow everything in my body.
Right.
But I'm not doing a lot of aggressive plyos and things like that. But I don't want to lose that ability to recruit muscle fast if I want. So I find like eccentric training is super useful for that. And the other part related to muscle loss, my revelation this past year, is that when you look at those graphs, you see, okay, as people age, you see this linear function and they just lose more muscle. But that's average data.
Right.
If you look at individual data, it's not a straight linear line, it's a step function. And the step function happens when they get injured. Meaning something happened, they got injured, they're in the hospital now for 7 days, they're on crutches or whatever. It's 12, 15, 16, 24 weeks for them to recover. They've lost a lot of muscle mass. And now, yes, you can train. Yes, you can get that back, but it's going to take a while to get it back. And then, what if you get injured again during that process?
Right.
Like now you're a severe negative area because you took an insult, you just started coming back. Now you take another insult. And I think that's vastly, or at least for me, was very underappreciated. That, yes, you have to train intelligently. Yes, you need to kind of push the envelope to get adaptation, but you don't really want to risk injury unless it's something you really love doing.
Yeah, and that's, like my big things are, especially for endurance training, are consistency, specificity, and progression, and it's consistency over everything. It's like you have to
violent consistency.
You have to make exercise and all of this sort of stuff a habit over time, and that's what's going to lead to the best outcomes. Because like my uncle, for example, he had double knee replacement, and over the course of the last, I hadn't seen him in a really long time, but essentially he went from like doing all of his own stuff, and now he's wheelchair bound, and he is essentially wasted away. And it's because he he got an infection in one of his knees and then other things like that. And it's like, man, like they were like, oh yeah, this is going to be an easy surgery. Everything's going to work out. And now, it's just like one thing after the other. And if you measured his muscle mass, I can guarantee you it went from, moderate, functional amount of muscle mass to like, who knows if he's ever going to be able to walk again. And, so obviously, it's like you can't plan to have all of those complications with things like surgeries and other things like that. But the more you can set yourself up, for a high level of, say, muscle mass, high VO2 max, other things like that, the longer you have until you reach kind of like a critical point. Because I'm pretty convinced that it's probably variable person to person, but there's some level of critical muscle mass, critical VO2 max, critical, something like those sort of things from a physiological perspective that once you pass that point, there's really no coming back.
Yeah, I think I could be wrong in this number, but I think the cutoff point for VO2 max for ADLs, so activities of daily living, I think is 18. Does that sound right?
I don't know,
Somewhere
but that
there
wouldn't surprise me. And it's like, if you think
You'll
about
see
that,
on charts, once you get below that, it's like you're. And I remember seeing this happen to my grandma. She, luckily lived to, be like 102. But when she was in the nursing home, you could see that, and we did everything we can, to try to keep her moving. And she went to a walker and then a wheelchair, and then she couldn't move. But even just getting her on the walker to go in the hallway to do some exercise, towards the end, she was good for almost exactly 30 seconds.
Yeah.
And then at that point, it was done. It was lights out.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, you have no aerobic system left.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was something that happened with my grandma. Is like, she would just sit in front of the TV all day, and it would be like she would come over and she'd walk up like the 3 steps to get into our house, and it was like she was just breathing hard and like sweating, and like you're like, oh my goodness, like you must not move at all. So it's those sort of things you're trying to protect from getting to that point where a VO2 max effort is walking up the stairs, right? Because that's like what it turns into. And then it's like, then there's no motivation, because every time you go to do any physical activity, it's like, oh, well, that's a VO2 max effort. It's like, if anyone's done a VO2 max workout, they're rough. But imagine having your VO2 max workout be walking up 3 steps. Like,
yeah. And the good part is you can still train it when you're older. I think, I can't remember who did this, but there's a case study of a guy who took up rowing, I think at age 72, I think. And at 90 was like one of the world's most elite rowers for his age group.
Yeah.
Right. And he never did any exercise until he was 72. And, several years later, and they printed his workout of what he was doing. And I can't remember what it was, but I remember looking at it going, shit, that's damn impressive. And he's 90.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I tell people is like, if you're not dead, you can still grow.
Oh yeah.
Like, and that's like all of these charts and stuff like that show like the decline over time as you age and other things like that are like, in my opinion, very discouraging to people, because they're like, oh, well, I'm 60 and my VO2 max is already down here. It's just going to keep going down. I was like, you've never worked out in your life. You can definitely improve your VO2 max above what it is now. Like you can get stronger than where you're at now, like all of these sort of things. So that's my positive message to everybody is like, you can, be encouraging, with like the older athletes or your older individuals who are, like, oh, well, I can't start now because it's too late for me. It's never too late.
No. And almost all those charts, my pet peeve is their general population, and most people don't train.
Right. So it's like, of course, you're going to decline over time if you're not training.
So if you are training and you're doing things intelligently, that data doesn't really apply to you. Now, again, I'm not saying you're going to keep going up forever. There's definitely, age is going to get all of us. You're definitely going to see, downturns for sure.
Right.
But your downturn isn't necessarily going to look like most of the data you've seen.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. So that was metabolic flexibility. Do you have a little bit of time to talk about like physiological flexibility? Because we've kind of been touching on this, but I mean, I watched your little like doodle video of your flexible physiology cert, and I was like, wow, this is actually really good because you really walk through, I think like four separate physiological systems. It's temperature regulation, pH regulation, glucose, which is really close to, kind of like our metabolic flexibility sort of idea, and then our O2 CO2 system. Yep. So if you wouldn't mind just giving maybe like a brief introduction on this, and then we can kind of, I don't want to take you, talk to you until tomorrow morning, but if you just give us a brief introduction, and then maybe we can touch on just some things that people can do in order to flex these physiological systems. I think that would be a fun way to end the episode.
Yeah. So after I started doing metabolic flexibility stuff, which probably started, it's coming up on maybe 15 years ago now. Probably about 3 or 4 years after that, I was like, okay, so that's kind of a cool idea. We know that fine scale variability shows up in all these physiologic systems. We know that this stuff seems to work pretty good for metabolism. What would we do if we took these concepts and we scaled them up to you as a human organism? And my premise was, let's assume that you're pretty good with nutrition, you're pretty good with exercise, and your sleep isn't a floating trash bin fire. So like the basics, like you're not perfect. We'll give you an 80%, maybe 85%. You're a solid B student in those things right now. Then how do we know what are the other things that would make you better, and what do we define as better? So my assumption was better is going to be more resilient and increase your ability to recover. So I do like Nassim Taleb's idea of anti-fragile. So if I have a ceramic bowl and I drop it on my tile floor, it's going to break. It's very brittle and becomes fragile under high impact. If I have a Tupperware container and I drop it, it's going to bounce. Cool, it didn't break. But the Tupperware container isn't really going to get better. Or physiologic systems, if I go do right bicep curls and we look a couple days later, oh wow, my right bicep is just a little bit bigger. There's a little bit more muscle fiber there, a little bit more connective tissue. I gave it an insult or a stimulus, and it actually got a little bit better because of these stressors applied to the system. The system is then what they call anti-fragile, meaning that it got a little bit better because of stress applied. The Tupperware container, as many times as I drop it and stress the shit out of it, doesn't get any better. So I was like, oh, okay, that's super cool. So what areas then do we need to stress in order to become better and more resilient over time? Because if we're already doing the stuff we need to get the stimulation for our body, we're doing good nutrition recover, we're doing sleep, then I think the rate limiter is how fast we can recover and how fast we can handle just the other insults of life, right?
Yep.
Because people want to do things, right? I like going to concerts. I'll go to a metal concert till 1 a.m. sometimes. I'll try to go kiteboarding, and hopefully the goal this fall is to do a 30-foot jump and land it. All right. Sometimes shit doesn't go well, and I hopefully have enough ability that I can do that and recover from it. So I started looking and going, okay, so what systems does the body absolutely 100% have to hold constant, or you're in a world of trouble?
Right.
And the systems that I came up with, and these are not the only ones, but I'd say the main ones are exactly what you said, right? Some form of temperature. Humans are homeotherms. We like, it's actually 97.7, but everyone says 98.6. This is how weird I am. Like, I don't trust anything I read when I start a new course.
Yeah.
And the best data on temperature is actually 97.7. But anyway. But either way, we can only fluctuate by our core temperature a few degrees higher or a few degrees lower. We're in a world of hurt.
Right.
However, we could go sit in cold water for a fair amount of time. Be fucking miserable, but we could do it. You could go in a hot environment. And with training, we can withstand these things even more. Why? Because the system adapts. Same thing with pH, like you talked about lactate. If you start doing horrible pH-based work, like super high-intensity stuff, it sucks, but you get better at buffering those hydrogen ions. You literally get better at buffering an acid that's introduced into your muscular system. Expanded fuels, everything from ketones to lactate, and then breathing, like how well your body's going to regulate oxygen, how well it's going to regulate CO2. And so those are kind of the 4 pillars. And the whole goal is that you're not really going to change like your temperature. Like you're not really going to change your core body temperature, but you're going to increase the physiologic bandwidth on each one of these systems so that if you go into a hot environment, you're more heat adapted, or you go into a cold environment, you're more cold adapted. You do some high intensity stuff, you're more able to handle that. And what's super cool is that there is weird cross adaptation effects across these divergent systems. So for example, one of the coolest studies they did was they said, okay, we're going to expose people to a hypoxic environment, right? So low level of oxygen, very, very stressful for humans. Humans don't like it for good reason. But what they did is they gave one group a cold water immersion before, the other group they did not. And they exposed both groups to the same hypoxic environment. The group that got the cold water immersion beforehand reported that the hypoxic environment wasn't nearly as stressful as the other group. And there's a little bit of crossover there in some of the molecular signaling and things of that nature. But when I read that, I was like, I didn't expect that. I'm like, if you would have told me cold water immersion before hypoxic environment will make you tolerate it better, I'd say you're out of your tree. Those have nothing to do with each other.
Yeah.
But these cross adaptations, and there's very, very, very little data on this at all. It just literally no one's really looked at it. I think there's a lot of cross adaptations that we don't even know about yet. And so you ever like sit around and think like, I don't know, like all the ideas in the world, everyone's already done them. Like the only thing, if I were to hang my hat on anything that I've come up with, I will probably go to my grave thinking and yelling that like physiologic flexibility, like these 4 pillars, if people just keep training these, I can't prove it with research yet, but I feel very confident that only more and more beneficial things are going to happen to those types of humans.
Right.
And if you look at humans who are very resilient, high-level athletes, people who do this stuff, shocker, all of them kind of sort of do a lot of those things, whether they were doing them on purpose or not.
Right. Yeah, like or like exposing themselves to those sort of things or not, right? Like the people who come to mind are, like really high altitude individuals like Sherpas and other things like that. Like their mitochondrial physiology is insane.
It's bonkers.
Yeah,
because they were born at that environment. Like they are so adapted to that environment. It's crazy to me that yes, it is an accomplishment to do those kind of hikes, but you have people there who do that shit all the time, and they're like, fuck, no big deal.
Yeah, I did. I know, it's insane. I did. I hiked to Machu Picchu in Peru.
Oh, cool.
And we had, like, we hired like an expedition guide and other things, and they were porters, and they were carrying 70 pounds.
Yeah.
And they were doing the same thing as we were doing in half the time. And then waking up at 4 a.m. the next day and just being able to continue on, doing that sort of stuff. And you're just like, holy shit, I thought I was in shape. And these guys, are because they're exposing themselves to that stress more and more and more and more. It's not actually as much of a stress anymore, right? It's not as much of a deviation in homeostasis, where it's like the first time you get into even a moderately cold tub, your body might just go into like freak out mode, and it's awful. It takes forever to come down from it. And I think you might have been one I was listening to, but you might have said something along the lines of like, oh, I think people do cold water immersion too much, like too hard, too fast.
Yep.
So you were probably the person, saying like, no, you got to start maybe at like 60 degrees.
Yeah.
And then you ramp it up. And that's something that, like, I kind of give my mom a little bit of flack, and I obviously love her so much, but she, anytime like I go home, it's like the thermostat is set to 72, and we are not changing it. It does not change no matter what we do. So I'm always opening the windows because I like to sleep in the cold. And maybe this is an exercise in my physiological flexibility, right? Being able to sleep in warmer environments.
Mm-hmm.
But I keep kind of trying to tell her, like, you have to expose yourself to cold so your body can get better at dealing with the cold, and then expose yourself to warm as well. You have to have those contrasts, because then your operating range goes from here to here, and I think that's what you're really describing, is like you need to stress each system, whether it's adding in a shitload of protons from extremely high intensity exercise, or like BFR strength training, or whatever you want to call it, all the way to even, do you find, because you mentioned, I think in your introduction, like, do you find that Wim Hof breathing, is that a way of like moving the needle? Because you would conceivably make yourself maybe a little bit more basic. You obviously control pH really, really well by blowing off all this CO2, and then the whole buffering reactions and stuff are going to go the opposite way. So is that a method of going the other way with pH, or is that more of a O2 CO2 sort of thing? They're obviously still related, but
yeah, I would say at rest, you can, by doing Wim Hof or Tumo or superventilation methods, you can actually, there's pretty good data showing you can alter pH temporarily. You can be more on the alkaloid type side.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, yes, it is a good way to do that. It's a good way to periodize it, I think, for certain periods of time. I would add a caveat, like all of these things, there's no free lunch with anything.
Right.
And the question is, at what cost?
Yep.
Right. So my thought early on, many, many years ago, was, okay, so I found the data. It says Wim Hof superventilation method can temporarily make my pH better, air quotes, more alkaline.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Okay, so I'm going to do that before I do my crazy high intensity intervals, because my blood's more basic. Then
I'll have more time.
I will do better on the high intensity intervals.
Yep.
That was a shit show. That did not work at all. Right? And the simple answer there is there's something called the Bohr effect. You have the Haldane effect. And you basically have screwed with your gas levels so much that you're not getting enough oxygen into the tissue you want. So my performance was dog shit.
Yep.
But to do that at rest, I do think there is some benefit for it. Now, again, you have to look at what individual wants to do this. If you are someone, so I added this part to the course now. So if you have an Oura Ring, and you're looking at, Apple will do this too, Garmin will do this, look at your respiration rate overnight.
Mm-hmm.
If your respiration rate is high, I would say 15, 16, 17, 18 breaths per minute, when you're sleeping, do not do Wim Hof breathing. You are already over breathing. You are already getting rid of too much CO2.
Mm-hmm.
The last thing you want to do is upregulate a system that's going in the wrong direction.
Right.
So you would do the opposite. You need to change your CO2 tolerance, which we could have a whole discussion about what even is CO2 tolerance.
Yeah.
But you would do some longer exhales. You would do more nasal breathing. You would do more zone 2 stuff with a 4-second exhale. You would do all these things to build up a little bit of CO2 and change those chemoreceptors, which are on your body, your brainstem, everywhere else, so that over time your respiratory rate is now starting to come down. And that was the hardest part with the whole course, because everybody wants to take one thing out and be like, oh, Wim Hof breathing, everybody do Wim Hof breathing, that's the best thing forever. And I was probably one of those people early on. And then I started seeing people, it was actually CrossFit people, this one gal, I could not figure out what the hell happened to her HRV. I was for weeks just bothering the shit out of me. I'm like, your HRV is tanking. So we went through nutrition, we went through sleep, we went through everything. Eventually she's like, oh yeah, I started doing cold water immersion and Wim Hof breathing. I'm like, okay, like how long are you doing cold water? Well, you know, I saw Joe Rogan videos, so I started at like 40 degrees for 5 minutes. I'm like, how did you feel? She's like, fucking horrible. I hated it.
But I kept
control
doing
my breath the whole time, hyperventilating. But I did my Wim Hof breathing in the morning before I did that. And I'm like, you just pinged your whole sympathetic system like mad. You went from 0 to like 100 miles per hour. Like those things might be beneficial depending upon your respiratory rate. But again, let's start easy. Let's see how your body responds to it. It'd be like going to the gym and saying, I've never deadlifted before. I'm going to start with 405.
Right.
That sounds like a good weight.
Oh,
right? You don't need 405.
You know, Ronnie Coleman warms up at 405, so I should be able to do that, right? You know.
Yeah. I mean, you know, the first guy, Andy Bolton, to pull over 1,000 pounds, like his first deadlift was 600 pounds.
Yeah.
You're probably not Andy Bolton, right? I mean, you know, we're probably not.
Yeah.
You know, but for cold water, people are all like, hey man, it's got to be harder. It's got to be better.
Yeah.
I'm like, but you can, those are all stressors, right? And that's what people forget.
Yep.
Like you can override your ability to recover and go backwards. It doesn't mean what you did is wrong. It just means you got the dose wrong, whether that's sauna, whether it's high intensity, whether it's Wim Hof breathing, whatever it is. Exercise, for crying out loud. People can get rhabdo in a worst case scenario.
Yep.
Right. So again, you have to proceed in a better direction and slowly kind of titrate your way into these things.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I'm gonna check that my respiration overnight.
Yeah, definitely do.
I'm really curious about that now. But I've also had people, you know, like now with like there's all these books about breathing and nasal breathing and all this sort of stuff, and there's a few people who are constantly telling me, oh, it's not oxygen that's important, even though oxygen is really what's ultimately helping you make ATP at your mitochondria. But I digress. It's CO2, and CO2 is driving all this stuff because they read the book, and now they're like, oh, now I nasal breathe everything. And I'm like, you shouldn't, first and foremost, because you're eventually going to be limiting the amount of air that you can just move in and out. And like you said, there's no free lunch. If you're constantly trying to increase, say, CO2 tolerance, eventually you're going to have so much CO2 that you're actually unable to exchange the hydrogens that are being produced into the blood, right? If you're looking at buffering. So, you know, and yes, to some extent, probably having a little bit more CO2 around is going to allow for hydrogens or oxygens to be offloaded from the blood that's in the muscle.
To a point.
Yeah, it's always to a point. It's never like more and more and more is better. So you know, I want to encourage people as like, yes, when somebody claims that, you know, like changing your breathing patterns or something along those lines may be useful. It's like, yeah, it possibly could, but it's not the answer to everything. Just like keto diet isn't the answer to every diet for every single person, just like a high carb diet, you know, same sort of thing. You know, so it's so funny because, like, you know, coming out of my PhD and stuff is like, you're like, oh, I got, you know, like, I think I got all the answers. And then what the answers come down to is, well, moderation, right? You know, you need to do some high intensity stuff. You need to do some low intensity stuff. For some cases, you need to improve your CO2 tolerance. For other cases, you need to actually maybe decrease your CO2 tolerance in a sense. For some individuals, you're already riding the line of too high of blood glucose, so you need to manage that. For other people, maybe you got a little bit more, flexibility and ability to upregulate that. Same thing with pH, and then temperature as well, right? So that's like that. Those are all the things that I walk away with, and I think it makes it really hard, just from, say, a business perspective to like sell things, because you're like, oh well, I'm putting my flag in the ground, and my flag is it depends, as opposed to just choosing something, right, that could be the answer, but it's really not, because you need more explanation and you need more information before you actually make good decisions on something. So that's what I appreciate about all of your explanations today, right? Is, well, like we started with metabolic flexibility, and you're like, well, yeah, I can totally see how some people it could be very beneficial for people to do fasted zone 2, but for other people, maybe not. But then for other people, for your elite level athletes, maybe it could be, and so it's always fun, to have those conversations, and then kind of like the back and forth as well. It's like, he's like, yeah, because there's not one right answer to every single thing.
Yeah. And that was the hardest part. Like, I bet I don't know how many marketing people tell me for the PhysFlex cert, they're like, you're an idiot. Like, why are you trying to sell 4 certs in one? Yeah. And I'm like, and to some degree, they're 100% right. Would I probably make a lot more money just by selling the temperature portion or the pH portion or whatever? Probably. May I do that at some point? Maybe. But as more of a systems person, it bugs me, because the biggest thing I want people to get from it is that all these systems overlap and are semi-dependent upon each other.
Right.
They don't live in a vacuum. And the hardest part for me when I was doing the course was, how do you get the big picture across of, hormetic stressors, adaptive homeostasis, these concepts that'll make you, better. And then like the CO2, O2 regulation thing. Shit, I think I redid that section 4 or 5 times. And even now it's like, okay, I have an hour and a half to explain O2 and CO2 regulation, how it's applicable to you,
right,
to people who didn't really go to school for this.
Yeah.
And there's no way around the fact that the shit's complicated. Like, there isn't an easy explanation that's right most of the time. So it's like, how do you get most of it correct? And then stuff like CO2 tolerance. Like, you talk to Dempsey in Wisconsin, he's like, I don't even know what CO2 tolerance is. I'm like, great. The guy who's done more respiration work for research than probably any human on the face of the planet doesn't even know, when we say CO2 tolerance, what we're talking about.
Right.
Oh, great.
Yeah, but that's the thing, is like, I think there's like these buzzwords that get thrown around, and then people just perpetuate it because it comes from a source that is trusted at the time, but the justification for whatever it is, whatever term it is, isn't fully fleshed out, and people generally just accept it. They're like, oh well, yeah, if he's saying it, then it's probably true, unless we can prove almost with like beyond a shadow of a doubt that that's actually not a thing. It's that's why I kind of poke fun at like zone 2 training, because I'm like, I'm like, this whole concept of zone 2 has been around, since the turn of the century, when people were exercising. They're like, well, we realize that you can't just go and run really, really hard all the time. Like, you can try, but you get tired. So you got to do the easy stuff, and you got to do hard stuff. And now somebody just coined a term, and then it's stuck, right? And it just so happens to be the delineation point between, zone 2 and zone 3 in a 5-zone training model. And it's like, well, then who picked the 5-zone training model? Because that's another, kind of construct that's just like doesn't really make sense. And so, yeah, there's.
Yeah. And even unlearning the stuff you thought you learned in college that was correct. Like, I still remember probably 8 years ago now, I think I saw Aaron Davis stick a moxie on someone in Austin at a seminar Ben House and I were at. Ben was running the seminar, invited me down there, a bunch of other people. And I think the person was on a Concept 2 rower and did a 30-second wind gate. And so they warmed up. I'm looking at the thing. Okay, they're at 87 or 85%. By the end of the 30 seconds, I think they were down to like 21%.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at this going, what the fuck am I seeing?
That's
like
anaerobic.
This is supposed to be I was told this is a Wingate test. This is
Yep.
100% anaerobic.
Yep.
So either this device is wrong or everything I learned was wrong.
Yeah.
And it turns out everything I learned was wrong.
Right.
And so that messed me up for like literally 5 years. Like, no joke. I
Yeah.
was like, oh, shit.
Yeah. But then it's like, okay, well, question everything. That's something that was, that's taught in a lot of exercise physiology classes is stroke volume plateaus at 40% VO2 max. And if you look at like all the data out there, it's like, well, it depends on the individual, and there's
on average maybe.
No, but it doesn't even seem to be on average, because I just had to I did this for my exercise physiology course, and it seemed like, from what I found, it's like with some people, yes, it does plateau at 40. But with other people, it actually goes up and then comes down. With other people, it goes up and then might have a slight shift and then keeps going up. With other people, it just keeps going up the whole damn time. So it's like, so it's like things that we're taught that we're so sure about. And I listened to your body composition podcast episode at one point, and it was talking about, like, the guys on there were talking about how the gold standard and the errors in body composition measurement.
Oh yeah, Grant Tinsley and Eric Helms.
Yeah. I was like, holy shit, this is so illuminating. Or like the how many grams of water does 1 gram of carbohydrate hold on to? I used to be able to confidently say 3, because somebody told me that at one point, and they were like, well, it could be 3, it could be up to 12, depending on how you consume that carbohydrate and what you consume it with. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, this is way more complicated and complex. Like, I love it. I love the fact that the human body is the most complex machine that we have on the planet. But it also makes it really, really hard sometimes to say, communicate actionable, sort of items and data and other things like that to people. But
yeah, and stuff you think is correct. Like, I got worried on my comps for my PhD because they can ask you anything, you know. And I was using BodPod for my study. And, so you go all the way back to, BodPod is based on underwater weighing. We're just using air instead of water.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spent, God, I don't know how many weeks, like, making sure I knew where all the equations came from and all this stuff. And I realized for underwater weighing, almost everyone on the face of the planet you have to estimate how much, basically, lung volume is left. So for people who don't know, stick your head underwater, exhale as much air as you possibly can. But we're not going to collapse your lungs, so there's still this residual volume, this RV that's left. Well, it turns out that's on a chart in our thing that's from unpublished data from like 3 people. And as far as I know, everybody uses that exact same chart.
Right. And
I'm like, oh shit. Like, this is the gold standard for body comp. Right? And then you go down the path of, Jackson-Pollock equation for site-specific stuff. I think that's based on 3 cadavers. I could be wrong on that.
Wow.
But I mean, like, stuff we think that is the accepted gold standard.
Yep.
Even a heart rate variability. One of the papers I wrote 13 different versions and never got published was a simple, take the same RR intervals, let's run it through 2 of these different types of basically equations that are used, window modeling, blah, 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 and then do you get the same answer? Because I looked through all the literature, something that basic, no one's done it. The assumption is it should be the same.
Right.
But I could not find it at all. And it turns out no one wants to publish it now because, shocker, 40 years later, if we do, it looks like we missed something that was important, and no editor wants to touch it with a 10-foot pole.
Right.
So it never got published.
Right.
So it's like, oh, man.
I know. I think like, it's like the bottom line here is really, if you have the time and the resources, challenge everything. And if you don't, you can reach out to myself, or I'm sure Mike would love to kind of, go back and forth and stuff like that and talk to you guys, talk to people about it. But it's like, challenge everything. And if you do have a question that you think is like the gold standard, think about it. And if you can't, find stuff that supports it, then maybe you got to question it a little bit deeper, right?
Yeah. Here's a quick one for you. I won't go into detail, but metabolic hearts. There is, as far as I can tell, there is no gold standard that is compared to on metabolic hearts. They're all compared to each other.
Yeah, and people have said, oh, well, a mixing chamber is the gold standard, but it's like I think that's kind of like DEXA machine being like, oh, well, we decided that DEXA was the gold standard. Right. So I think that's what happened. I don't know, but I don't know. So now with these, breath by breath devices and other things like that are coming out, that's why we can have such disparity in terms of, like the measurements. Like, even though you might have, say like a really, really precise oxygen concentration measurement tool within, or oxygen sensor within your device, because it's not, because when we go to compare it to a mixing chamber, it's not the same. People are like, oh, it's not accurate anymore. And that's where I always come back to is like, can you measure something and have it be repeatable? And as long as it's repeatable, just keep the same device and, keep the same protocol every single time, because then you can actually track changes over time. And, and it really is kind of a dick measuring contest to be like, well, what's actually, like, what is the gold standard? What's truly, like the true number, whatever it is we're trying to measure, where it's like, well, as long as, it's like, I'm sure you've had a class where it was like, looking at accuracy versus reliability or something along those lines.
Accuracy versus precision.
Or precision, yeah. And I'm sure you've showed it in some of your classes too. And I'm just like, well, I would just rather have, everything be, precise and maybe a little less accurate, as long as the precision is there, because then I know that if I'm doing the same measurement over and over and over again, the error that I'm introducing, at least from, other perspectives, is kind of controlled for.
Yeah, if you made a real difference or not. If there's a real change.
Yeah, exactly. So cool, Mike. This has been so much fun.
Thank you. I appreciate all the good questions.
Yeah,
it was pretty geeky, but that was fun.
Oh no. I think people are gonna love this episode. I mean, this was, so I think I might have said this offline, but this was kind of a little bit of a plug for your, certifications, your Flex Diet certification, your physiological flexibility certification. So if you guys are interested in any of that, want to learn more, head over to Mike's website. It'll be in the description of the podcast notes and those sort of things. Mike, where else can people find you if they want to reach out?
Yeah, best place is probably the website, which is MikeTNelson.com. Probably the best place is the newsletter. So if you go to MikeTNelson.com, there's a little newsletter icon. You can click on that. Just hit reply through that. I'll answer any questions you have, which, that'll be interesting. That's probably the best way. Probably 90% of my content goes to the newsletter. I do have some stuff on Instagram, which is just Dr. Mike T. Nelson, and the podcast, Flex Diet Podcast.
Yeah, go check it out. He's got tons of really, really cool, interesting, topics and really cool people that he's talked to. Actually, one of my favorites, just to leave you with this, it was your interview with the happiness researcher. I listened to that as I was heading to Nike cross country nationals, and I was just like, wow, it's never something that I would have kind of gone out of my way to look at, but I was just scrolling through your, who you talked to, and I was like, let's see what this woman has to say about happiness, because I certainly would like to be happier in my life, and then it's like, well, it's purpose and fulfillment and other things like that. But that was a really good one, so I highly recommend going and checking that out. Mike, thank you again for coming on. I really appreciate it. I'm hoping that this is the first of hopefully a few more conversations that we have going down the road. I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast. As always, you can catch me on Instagram. That's where I do most of my answering of questions and those sort of things. So if you have any follow-up questions based on this podcast or any topics or anything like that, please reach out to me on Instagram, Critical02. You can view this on YouTube, so you can comment down below if it's on YouTube, or you can even comment on Spotify now, and I can actually reply to them. So if you have any feedback or anything like that on Spotify, please leave the feedback, please leave the comments, those sort of things, and I'd be happy to respond on Spotify. So with that, really enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Mike T. Nelson, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.